Peace be upon you. Islam is often seen as an extreme and intolerant religion, but we've been getting a rather different view from Dr. Abdulhaq Compier. If you watch our last video, you'll be able to see his journey into Islam. But what we want to talk about in this video is how Islam gave you a new appreciation for your country. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, Assalamu alaikum.
Welcome, sir.
Yes, before I was Muslim, I grew up in a culture where nationalism was not appreciated. So this naturally meant that you would not consciously feel a lot of love for your country. I think this is quite specific for the Netherlands, actually. And anyway, so after I became Muslim, because Islam teaches you to love many things, like love your fellow beings, but also love your country. And this really also developed in me that I started loving my country more. When this happened, I also developed sympathy for the founding father of the Netherlands, obviously, because, you know, when you love your country, you have to love the founding person, probably. And
it helps.
So I developed sympathy for founding father as well.
Who was?
Who was Prince William of Orange.
Okay.
And what was the kind of environment that he was living in at the time?
Yeah, that's very interesting because this is the 16th century. And this is an era where the Catholic Empire was at its peak. And the Netherlands was part of the Spanish Empire.
Okay. Right, wow.
And the Prince William of Orange was working for the Spanish king as a governor of the Netherlands. And he had to also represent the religious ideas of the Catholic king.
Right. What was his struggle? Was it to do with the different sects that were emerging in Christianity and how he dealt with them, or was it something else?
Yeah, so in the 16th century, you also had the Protestant reformist movements in Christianity coming up, like the Calvinists and the Lutherans. And they were speaking up more, and the Catholic king would persecute them. So Prince William of Orange would have to comply with the persecution of his fellow countrymen.
Oh, I see.
And his struggle was that this was something very horrible to do for him, probably, because people were literally burnt at the stake very often for having a different belief.
Okay. And what caused you to develop sympathy for him in a way?
Well, so what's interesting about him is that he asked for moderation of this persecution laws. He asked for moderation to the Spanish king, but the Spanish king wouldn't compromise. And so then William of Orange became a leader of a revolt against the Spanish Empire.
Oh, really?
Where the Dutch Republic would become independent from Spain.
Wow.
So your nation was actually born out of a rejection of intolerance?
Indeed. It's a very nice point.
Okay, fine. So how does that feed into your view on Islam, and what did that lead you to do in terms of your research?
Yeah, so what's very interesting about William of Orange is that he was very outspoken about his wish for universal tolerance of religions. And this idea didn't exist in Europe at all.
Okay.
So the Spanish Empire...
So it didn't exist?
No, it didn't exist. It was just regarded as a folly.
Okay.
And because Christianity would say that only the true church would lead to salvation.
Yeah.
And if you're not led to salvation, you are actually kind of a devil.
Oh, okay.
And so the task of the ruler of the country would be to cleanse the country of these evil, people, these devils, and that was the reason for the persecution.
So in a way, that's linked to the concept of original sin, isn't it? In a way,
definitely. So it's very much linked to Christianity, and
Because people are considered to be evil at baseline, and then they need salvation from their evil condition that they're born with through the true church. But that's contrasted with Islam, I guess, isn't it? Which is that every person, according to the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, he said every child is born a Muslim on the fitrat or the nature of Allah, and finds that child would, if left alone in a way, they would find themselves inclined to the right path naturally.
Yes,
but it is their parents who make them a Christian, a Jew, etc.
Absolutely. So in the world where William of Orange lived, tolerance was just a non-existing idea. It was not possible. And so it's very interesting that he would be so outspoken about his support for a law that would tolerate every religion. So I thought this was so fascinating about him and also quite sympathetic. But I also thought that it is very unlikely that he would develop this idea all by himself. And also I started to sense that there is a link with Islam, although in our Dutch history lessons we never get to be taught any link with the Muslim world. But I was sensing that Islam is quite unique about tolerance of religions, because a unique teaching of Islam is that all the religions come from the same God.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
Which means for Muslim rulers that they have to tolerate these religions because they come from God.
Right.
And no other religion has this concept. This is only in Islam.
That you must believe. It's not optional. It's you must believe in all religions, major religions, being from having a divine source, even if they've been interpolated and misinterpreted and misapplied. But they all have truth at their very origin.
Right.
Whereas the opposite is true in every other religion, actually. To be a Muslim, you have to believe in the divine origin of all religions. To be a Christian, you cannot believe in the divine origin of any other religion. You certainly can't believe in the divine origin of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, as a prophet of God, I mean.
Yes. So for Muslims, somebody with another religion would have access to salvation, but in a more limited way or in a slower way. But it would not be a devil.
Yeah.
That has to be exterminated from the country.
Yes. Okay.
So this is quite different from the world of William of Orange. And so how did William of Orange get this idea that you can just tolerate every religion and it would lead to prosperity instead of disaster? And so I sensed this that there could be a link with Islam. So I started searching for that.
And it culminated in this excellent paper that you've written. I believe the title, Let the Muslim Be My Guide in Outward Things. So, Let the Muslim Be My Master in Outward Things, references to Islam and the promotion of religious tolerance in Christian Europe, published at the Al-Islam e-Gazette in 2010. So we'll put a link in the description box below to that. What did you find in your research about how this developed, how tolerance developed in Europe itself?
Yeah, so I think it's good to stay with William of Orange to get the answer to that. Actually, the story starts already from the first caliphs of the Muslim world. So the first caliphs after Prophet Muhammad.
And indeed, actually, with the Prophet Muhammad himself, perhaps.
Yes, of course, Islam started with the Prophet Muhammad himself. But you could say that the influence on Christianity might start from the Caliph, maybe from the Caliph Umar.
Yeah.
Right.
Because the Caliph Umar conquered Jerusalem.
Yeah.
And he was extremely sympathetic and protective of the rights of the Christian inhabitants.
Yeah, I've got two quotes here from your article, actually. It's Omar went so far as to pray by the side of the road in order to prevent Muslims from erroneously turning the church where he visited into a mosque out of a sentiment for their caliph. Taxes were not to be collected harshly, and when the Muslims were unable to guarantee safety to the people, they returned the taxes. And then another quote, sometime after taking the city, Omar, may Allah be pleased with him, invited the Jewish families to live to live in the city once again, because there were Jews who had been expelled from Jerusalem, and he asked them to be brought back. Omar himself took the initiative in the restoration of the Temple of Solomon, which was destroyed by the Romans and had been used by the Christians as a dump ever since.
Yes.
So that's a very powerful symbolism there as well.
It is an amazing story of the Caliph Umar in Jerusalem that I would also recommend everybody to read more about. And but we can say that the influence of Islam in this idea of tolerance started there, because already there the references start from Christians who say that, who were amazed at the governance of the Muslims. For example, the 12th century historian Michael the Syrian said that the Muslims did not inquire about the profession of faith, nor did they persecute anybody because of his profession, as did the Greeks, which he found a heretical and wicked nation. The amazing thing about the Muslims was they didn't even ask what your religion was. You were just a human being with the right to live and protection and everything. And anyway, so these references by Christians start here. The Christians are impressed by the tolerance of Muslims already at that time. But I will now just jump to William of Orange again, just because of that the people can understand the relation with the Muslim world more. The first references by Christians to the tolerance of Muslim rule stems from the time of the Caliph Umar. But let's go back to William of Orange 900 years later to understand this influence well. An interesting thing about this age is that the revolutionaries in Holland, they used a phrase which is very typical for their time, and in which they said that they would rather be subject to the Turk than subject to the Pope.
Okay.
And they would chant this phrase even in their demonstrations in Antwerp, where they would destroy all the idols in the churches. They would be chanting this phrase.
Oh, really?
Wow.
And so when I was looking for a connection...
So when they as Protestants would be destroying Catholic idols, basically, or Catholic statues, what I would say.
Yeah, so this is called in Dutch it calls the Beeldenstorm, so storming the idols.
Okay.
And they would even chant this phrase that they would rather be Turk than
under the Pope, yeah. Because the Netherlands was a colony of Spain, Catholic Spain,
right,
at the time.
Yeah, and so the people who wanted to become independent, the Protestants who were also critical of the Catholic religious practice, they also wanted to be independent or wanted to be free to practice their religion. Anyway, so they would have this very mysterious slogan. And of course, when I was looking for a connection between William of Orange and the Muslim world, this, of course, came to my attention.
Yeah.
And where a connection with the Muslim world is mentioned.
Yeah.
And so this was really a good way to start this understanding this connection.
Yeah.
And maybe also for our viewers. This phrase is quite well known, actually. So there are medallions, silver medallions in the shape of half moons, and the people would carry that on their clothing.
Wow!
And they would sing this song that to put silver half moons on your sleeve, rather Turk than Pope.
Okay.
I mean, that's a very serious thing, especially in 16th century Europe. Like, it's such a stark statement. Even now, it would be.
Yeah, it would be.
It would be exceptional.
Yeah, that would be something for Andrew Tate probably to do.
Yeah, it's at that level. It's kind of so stark. So they were really rejecting this kind of the persecutory nature of the Catholic Church. But the way that they're doing that is saying, I'd rather be basically under the Ottomans. So what was it about the Ottomans that they saw as so aspirational?
Yeah, but wait a moment, because the accepted interpretation of this slogan is not immediately as you are doing now,
right,
which is obvious, But in the Dutch history class, you would not get this interpretation. You would just get the interpretation that the Protestants would rather be dead or rather follow the devil than they would follow the Pope.
Okay.
Right.
Which is such a prejudiced thing to do, this interpretation.
Yeah, such a prejudiced interpretation of that statement.
It is.
Why not then say better to be dead than to be under the Pope?
Exactly.
Why choose the Turk?
So it just doesn't it just doesn't match. It just doesn't feel good, this interpretation at all. And obviously for me this was a very good link with the Muslim world, but I had to do some research to get the sources from that time, where they would explain why the people would say this. But alhamdulillah, after I was able to find the references where they would explain that the Protestants said this because they would have religious freedom in the Ottoman Empire. So the Turk actually means the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, the ruler of the Turks.
Okay.
The Great Turk, he was called. And so the sources say that the Protestant Christians would say this thing because they would have freedom of religion in the Ottoman Empire or under the rule of the Turk and not under the rule of the Pope.
Yeah.
And so this was a meaning. And now it becomes very obvious to understand, right, what happened. It's still, of course, when we don't think that there is any connection between Europe and the Ottoman Empire, it's still a very strange thing to say. And we often get in our history classes that, okay, that's the Muslim world over there.
Yeah.
The Western world is over here. We have the Renaissance and everything, and they're doing their own thing.
Yeah.
But this is obvious, of course, not how the historical reality was.
Yeah,
there was constant interaction.
Yeah,
just as there is today.
Yeah, and there was so much. There was at that time such a difference in level of civilization, where the Muslim world was so powerful in everything.
Yeah,
and it would be a constant military threat, and there was just so much influence going on. So. It is not a strange thing that the Protestants would have had an experience in the Ottoman Empire where they would get this idea from.
In that regard, I want to quote something that you've written in this paper. You say, the tolerance of the Ottomans provided a shelter for the emerging Protestant movements of Luther and Calvin. In 1548, the Catholic authorities requested the Sultan's representative in Hungary to either execute or drive out the Hungarian pastor, I won't get his name right, Imre Szigeti, because of his Protestant preaching. So there's a Hungarian pastor who's preaching a Protestant teaching, and the Catholic authorities want the Sultan's representative in Hungary, because the Ottomans had Hungary under their own rule, to actually drive him out or execute him. And the chief intendant of the Pasha of Buda not only denied their request, so one of the Sultan's governors, not only denied their request, but issued an edict of tolerance which said that, quote, preachers of the faith invented by Luther should be allowed to preach the gospel everywhere to everybody, whoever wants to hear, freely and without fear, and that all Hungarians and Slavs who indeed wish to do so should be able to listen to and receive the word of God without any danger, because this is the true Christian faith and religion. So, I mean, that's quite an extraordinary statement, actually. Which very much supports what you've actually been outlining for us, I think.
Yeah. So you can see what's happening there, that the Catholics were there first.
Yeah.
So the Catholics also had their churches in the Ottoman Empire.
Okay.
And
so it's not like they stopped the Catholics but permitted the Protestants. They actually permitted both.
Yes. So it's very interesting that the Ottoman Sultan would be in military conflict with the Catholic Empire, but he would still tolerate the Catholics to practice their religion in the Ottoman Empire.
Right.
But the Catholic priests would say, we were here first.
Yeah.
And when the Protestants came, they said to the Sultan that, no, these are not, we don't like these people. We were here first. You should throw them out.
Yeah. Wow.
The Sultan said that, look, you have freedom, they have freedom too.
Wow.
And that this is actually the true Christian faith. So he was actually teaching the Catholic authorities what Christianity was, that the true Christian faith is to be tolerant of others.
Yeah,
Well, Jesus'
that
teaching.
might be an interpretation,
Yeah.
or it could be that the Ottoman Sultan would be sympathetic to the Protestants because they were against idolatry.
Okay, fine.
And this is what I meant in the Word of God.
Oh, yes, okay. Yeah, fine.
And even there is correspondence between the Ottoman Sultan and the British Queen, also in the same century, where he would express his sympathy for the Christians who would not commit idolatry.
Okay.
Anyway, so this might also be the reason why he says that this is a true Christian faith. It might also have a different reason.
Yes.
Anyway, but this is a nice example. So this is 16th century.
Yeah.
I just want to go back now in history a few centuries towards the 13th century, just to show that this phrase that the Dutch Protestants were using, that they would rather be subject to the Turk than subject to the Pope, that this actually has a very long history.
Oh, okay.
And so I just said that in our history classes, we should not teach anymore that the Muslim world is there and we are here, and there is no reason that they would say such a thing, that they would rather prefer to live under the Sultan. So that's the first thing. But the second thing is that this phrase also did not come out of nothing.
Yeah.
It has a very long history already for many centuries. For example, and the most important reference is this one, which goes back to the 13th century, where the Catholics on the way to Jerusalem on their crusade, they would come. They would pass Constantinople, which is the Orthodox capital at the time, and they would just completely destroy the whole city. They would massacre all the Orthodox Christians, and they would loot all their belongings, and they would destroy the buildings on the way to Jerusalem on the crusade.
Yeah.
So this happened in the 13th century, and then there was apparently somebody, a Christian Orthodox patriarch, who's Michael III, and this is on page 6 of my paper. And he said the following thing: "Let the Muslim be my master in outward things, rather than the Latin, the Catholic, dominate me in matters of the spirit. For if I am subject to the Muslim, at least he will not force me to share his faith. But if I have to be under Frankish rule and united with the Roman Church, I may have to separate myself from my God."
Wow.
Such pathos in that. Such kind of passion and feeling.
Yeah. And it does so much justice to the Muslim rule, to that contrast with what Catholics were doing, whereas Muslims would just, if they conquered, they would also not be so brutal, but they would also allow freedom of religion.
And I think it's important for us to mention, although we were not going to be able to give a kind of lecture on this, but this the reason why this is there is because it's from the Quran. It's an Islamic teaching, La ikraha fid din, that there is no compulsion in religion. Often translated, there should be no compulsion in religion, or in matters of faith or beliefs. But actually, the kind of literal translation is just there is none. And I think it's hinting at the deeper truth that you cannot be compelled to believe something, because if you're compelled, you don't really believe it. So it's recognizing the reality and deriving the social rule from that, which is that you should never try and force someone in faith.
Because it's ineffectual.
Yeah, it's completely pointless.
Yeah.
And there are so many other references. You mentioned many of them in this paper as well, that show that, the Holy Prophet, peace be upon him, and Islam itself tells you to respect other people's beliefs. So this is something from Islam, and that's why we find it predominating in Muslim cultures. Obviously, there are exceptions. There are people who did become extreme, and especially more in recent times, contradicted that. But it still predominated throughout Muslim history because it was real and it was there.
And it was noted as a characteristic by those who considered themselves the enemies of Muslims.
Yeah, exactly. So it maybe is good to come back to these specific elements of Islam that would create this atmosphere of tolerance or this ideal of tolerance. But I can say briefly now that, like you said, there is the prohibition on compulsion in religion in the Quran. This is one aspect. One other aspect is that what we talked before, that all the religions come from the same God, and they must be respected for this sake. And a third one is, I think, is that Islam teaches that that every human being has a fitra, has a nature that has a connection to God. Every human being has a sanctity in itself, and should be deemed, how can you say?
Sacred in its own right.
In its own right. So here we can see that this phrase goes back like many centuries towards Constantinople, where the Orthodox Christians would say exactly the same thing in reference to the Catholics, and would also prefer the Muslim to rule them over the Catholics. In 1451, the Ottomans conquer Constantinople.
Allahu Akbar.
Yes. And which is a beautiful story in itself. I visited it a few weeks ago. It is an amazing place to be.
Yeah.
Well, the Christians still haven't stopped crying about this. You know this. You
They
look
did.
online, all these Christian commenters on our YouTube channels all the time.
Really?
Just this. Yeah, there's loads of them.
Well,
This
let me tell-
terrible loss for the Christian world. It's like, come on, guys, it's 600 years later. Get over it.
Okay, but we can now say to them, we can say to these Christians that this is not a loss for them.
Yes.
This is their victory, because without the Muslims conquering Constantinople, there would be no Christianity left there. There would be, maybe Catholicism would be left, but probably it would have destroyed itself because it was so evil.
Yeah.
So it would just have gone into something much worse. But because the Muslim conquered it, all the different Christian groups were still able to thrive there.
Wow, what an amazing thesis. So actually, through Islam, the different religions actually prospered.
Yes, definitely. And this maybe also go back to the time of the first caliph, because, or to Prophet Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, because he said that the Muslims have to help the Christians restore their churches and repair their churches.
Yeah.
But in a political sense, you can definitely make the argument that without Islam, Protestantism would have not existed,
Well,
because they needed Islam to develop themselves. To go back to the conquering of Constantinople in 1451, the government of Constantinople became anxious about the coming invasion of the Muslims. But there were also parts of the government who actually preferred the Muslims to come. And they would also again say exactly the same thing as the Dutch would say a few centuries later. And this patriarch in the 13th century would say, because this duke called Lucas Notaras said that he would prefer to see in Constantinople the turban of the Turk to the tiara of the Pope. The tiara is a crown. So this is almost exactly the same phrase as the Dutch would use a few centuries later.
Yeah.
So that's the point I want to make. This didn't come out of nothing. It was just, this is the classical Christian reference to the tolerance of the Muslim rule.
Okay. Which shows that it wasn't a unique thing amongst the Muslims at the time of the Dutch Protestant movement. It was actually something that endured over centuries.
Exactly.
And it carried on later. And the next example, one of the examples, you've given many examples in this paper, but you mentioned a few minutes ago about how Islam says that every human is sacred and has a soul and is a creation of God and is not automatically sinful until it accepts salvation through Christ. But that kind of that view extends to other beings as well. And you have this wonderful quote where you say that Landry argues that the writings of the Busbek on the Turks were widely read in the 17th to 18th century Britain, and are an example of the English fascination with Ottoman civilization. The English were jealous of the Turks' strange combination of self-esteem and love for minor creatures. When, for example, the plague broke out in Istanbul, and it was feared that dogs would spread the disease through the city, the Grand Mufti forbade the killing of the dogs, arguing that dogs also had souls. This was incomprehensible to Thomas Smith in the 1670s, who called this extravagant kindness barbaric.
Yes, exactly. So it's a good point to make and a good thing to mention that that shows the contrast between the Muslim world and the Catholic world or the Christian world, but also the contrast between the contemporary society or the view of Islam of contemporary society, the view of tolerance of contemporary society and of the Christian society at the time, because the Christians would say that tolerance is actually a form of tyranny.
Oh, really?
Because if you tolerate everything, maybe like the contemporary discussion, if you tolerate everything, everything goes out of hand. And this is a kind of tyranny to the pure religion. So if you would tolerate different religions, it's a kind of tyranny on the country, it's a tyranny on the true believers.
Okay.
And on the soul of the people.
Yeah.
And so so the people in that time, they would also say that they would be very much annoyed at the cooperation between the Protestants and the Ottomans.
Yeah.
And they would call tolerance, they would have a kind of a swear word for tolerance being Calvino-Turkism.
Okay.
It is.
I think we get what that means.
Yeah, so they would.
What are you, Turkish?
So if you would be tolerant, you would be just like a Turk.
Yeah. Okay. Right.
And so also this person who you just quoted, he thought that it was ridiculous not to respect the dogs in such a way that you would even risk the plague. Maybe the Muslims knew that the dogs weren't spreading the plague.
Yeah. Which they weren't. It was the rats.
Yeah. Maybe they knew, but anyway, it's a really great story that this Mufti made this statement that he was. And it's also such a nice thing about historical research that we can see such differences in the time, right? That this Mufti would say, "Don't kill the dogs."
Yeah.
Whereas now, at this time, we would imagine mullahs and muftis to be really cruel
Against dogs in particular.
against. Exactly. But this is the fun thing about historical research, right? So the Protestants wanted to become independent from the Catholic Spain. And every historian would say that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. But it is so sad that that in our history classes we are not taught this thing, that the Protestants must have thought of the Ottomans as their friend, even because it was the enemy of their enemy, the Catholics. But it was also militarily, it was also true that the interesting thing that happened militarily was that a friend of William of Orange, who was a Jew, he had to flee Antwerp for the Spanish Inquisition because he might have been burned at the stake.
I see. Yeah.
So he fled to Istanbul, and there he created a connection between the Sultan and William of Orange.
Between the Sultan, okay.
Just after the Beeldenstorm, the Storm of the Idols, the Sultan sent a letter of support to the Dutch for their cause of independence.
Yeah.
And this is never taught in our history classes, but it is so important because it also explains why a small country like this would have the courage to stand up against the Spanish Empire, which was the second most powerful empire. The first most powerful was the Ottoman.
Right. Okay.
And so the most powerful empire, the Ottomans, they showed their support for the small Protestant movement of independence. And this, of course, gave courage to the Dutch to take up this fight against Spain. And even there was some cooperation militarily established because some secret agents went back and forth between Netherlands and the Sultan. And they created this plan to attack at different fronts at the same time. So
Wow.
the Sultan said, okay, I will attack the Spanish in the Mediterranean. Mm-hmm. He attacked Tunis. And at the same time, the Dutch would attack a city, Leiden, actually.
Okay.
They would attack the city of Leiden so that the Spanish would be panicking on different fronts. Actually, they also tried to have the Moriscos, which were the Muslims that had been forcibly converted in Spain, to revolt at the same time.
Oh, okay.
I think that this didn't happen, but the two attacks did happen.
Mm-hmm.
And they were also successful. And the fun thing is that these Dutch revolutionaries, they came into Leiden in their ships, and their ships had Ottoman flags.
Oh, right.
And they were even wearing mustaches to fool the Spanish that they were Turks.
What?
So isn't this an amazing and fun connection?
Yeah.
You know, that it is such a beautiful story. And
I mean, it's remarkable for so many reasons, but it sounds really like, firstly, the idea that when they said rather be under the Turk than the Pope, the idea that that wasn't related to the Ottomans is obviously absurd from what you're saying. Obviously, absolutely out of the question. But also, it sounds like the Netherlands itself owes its existence towards the help and support of the major Muslim empire at the time.
At least they owed their self-confidence in the revolution to it.
Yeah.
And one of the victories, the victory of Leiden, was definitely a cooperation with the Turks.
Yeah.
And I can't, I mean, I'm not a historian on this, you are, but I feel like there can't have been that much to gain in a way from the Ottoman side. It seems like there was some sincere feelings towards the Protestants for the Ottomans to support them to this degree. And maybe that was religious it seems to have been maybe just humanitarian, the fact that they were being persecuted, the fact that they were supporting the oneness of God, maybe that was the religious aspect.
Well, not quite oneness of God, but they were not as idolatrous in respect of their religious
relative
practices.
to the Catholics.
But simultaneously, the Protestants, perhaps an own goal by the Ottomans to some extent, insofar as the Protestants took the doctrine of, sola fide, solely by faith, to the next level compared to the Catholics.
Do you know if they sensed that this was also politically advantageous against the Catholic Empire, or do you feel it was more of a sincere religious affiliation?
Well, I think at the political level, you probably would expect all these things to matter. Yeah. So obviously, it was also politically strategic to destabilize the Spanish Empire by supporting the revolution of the Protestants. Probably there was also a sympathy from the Ottomans that they were thinking that these Christians were getting closer to Islam. Yeah, I think they did. Yeah. So the Sultans.
Little did they know.
So the Sultans always they did. I think they always had religion high in their esteem. And there is also correspondence between the Sultan and the French king, where the Sultan would explain about his religious views. And
yes, I've got that right here, in fact. So there's King Francis I you've written about in your article, in your paper, and he'd become disenchanted with the Catholic Emperor Charles V. And Francis desired to become independent, and in 1528 sought an alliance with the famous Ottoman Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent. This resulted in an enduring military cooperation with an intensive exchange of letters. In his correspondence with Francis, Suleiman presented his tolerant policy towards Christians as a matter of imperial pride. The Sultan wrote, quote, "Places other than the mosques stay in the hands of Christians, and no one molests those who goes there. They all live peacefully under the wings of our protection," end quote.
Yeah, it's exactly following the example of the Prophet Muhammad and the Caliph Umar, where Umar would almost exactly say the same thing.
Yeah.
So I think these sultans were quite taking the religious values seriously.
When it came to tolerance, in particular of other faiths.
So going back to Holland, Netherlands. I think this is very interesting that ideologically, the idea of tolerance came to Holland, to the Netherlands, through all these discussions that started, in Constantinople, you can say, in Istanbul, where they would say they would rather have the Muslim there than the Catholic. So this went to Eastern Europe and then to France, and this ideologically, this discussion came there through to the Netherlands. But also there was this focus from the political and the military point of view, that there was a real political interest in cooperating with the Ottomans, and there was correspondence with the Ottomans. So the idea of tolerance also came to William of Orange,
and it's important because
this example.
It's important you mention the article because it's William of Orange in 1579 who succeeded in establishing the first declaration of universal tolerance in Europe, extending religious freedom not only to other Christians but also to Jews and even Muslims. So in a way, the birth of religious tolerance, very much is tied in with the founder of the Netherlands in Europe as a whole.
And thus in the West as a whole.
And thus in the West as a whole.
Yeah, I think so too. And because the example that comes before that is 1568, which is the Edict of Torda, which is seen as the foundation of the religious freedom, religious tolerance in America later on.
Yeah.
But it only tolerates different Christian sects. It doesn't even have universal tolerance. So William of Orange was so unique that he just said universal tolerance, and he didn't compromise on it. Maybe we can speculate that it was a condition of the support of the Ottomans. I have to talk to some more Turkish researchers who have access to more communication, maybe.
Yeah.
Maybe they know some more.
Yeah.
That the Ottomans said that they have to allow Muslims to live there or something.
Yeah, maybe they felt it could be an important trade route.
And the significant thing is that actually it was in the late 17th century that the William of Orange, 100 years later, he went and he became the King of England. So actually you had the transference, and then you had the King of Netherlands becoming the King of the United Kingdom at that time. And so you may have had the transference of that ethos and some of those principles from the Netherlands into the UK, and then through the British Empire, that policy effectively became established and ingrained in multiple legal systems across the world.
Could be.
I mean, you do talk about the influence on many other countries in Europe. Just coming towards the end, we'll briefly cover some of those. Voltaire, for instance, you quote. So this is obviously French Revolution.
Yeah, so this is like 3 centuries later.
Yeah.
2 or 3.
He says, let us reach out from our narrow little sphere for a moment and examine what goes on in the rest of the globe. The Turkish prince, for example, rules peacefully over 20 races of different religious conviction. 200,000 Greeks live in Constantinople in perfect safety, and the Mufti himself nominates and presents the Greek Patriarch to his emperor. There is even a Roman Catholic Patriarch living there. The Sultan nominates Catholic bishops to some of the Greek islands with the following words: I commend him to go and reside as bishop on the Isle of Chios in accordance with its ancient customs and vain ceremonies. And he goes on and he says, go to India, to Persia, to Tartary, and you will find the same evidence of tolerance and mutual respect. So, I mean, this is, again, remarkable because people often see, French as some of the luminaries of because it's slightly later Renaissance, of bringing in these Western liberal values. But the French luminaries themselves were quoting and taking inspiration from the Muslims. And this is centuries later, so it's not like it's one small dynasty in the 14th, 15th century that was good. Obviously, this is a thread that's going throughout time.
Yes.
Yes, we've charted it from actually the 12th century to the 16th century to 300 years after that in the 18th century.
Yeah, so just before the Enlightenment. So the Enlightenment probably also has a lot of influence from the Ottoman Empire.
Yeah.
But I didn't research it so deeply.
Yeah.
But I think you can say that this subject of tolerance goes from the conquering of Jerusalem by
Yes.
Caliph Umar towards the 18th century Enlightenment.
Well, I mean, it must. I mean, it's a fait accompli. You've kind of already proved it, because you've shown that these revolutionaries from across Europe were citing the Ottomans as their inspiration, and this is the Enlightenment as it happened.
Yes.
A little bit later. So I think it's an extremely important contribution that you've given in this article. And again, we will link this below so people can read things in full. We know that these values were imperfectly instituted in the West, but it did get to a level where the West has become, in many ways, a beacon of tolerance of different faiths. We, for instance, our family came here at least partly because of, and many others from the Ahmadiyya Muslim community.
Yeah,
they've come here because of the intolerance towards Muslims of other persuasions.
Yeah,
it's
a strange reversal.
Yeah, and this is kind of characteristic across the Muslim world, that they have become very intolerant. Reminds me of that verse, many verses of the Quran, which talks about how the day and the night alternate, and the interpretations talk about how times change. Empires alternate, and different peoples rise and fall at different times. What's your kind of how do you kind of view that surge of intolerance in the Muslim world? How do you kind of square that in your mind?
Yeah. So what you also notice when you do research, and that's also the value of PhD, and I think it's also a very Islamic thing, because the students in the religious schools in the Muslim world, they had to do, as their exam, they had to do an investigation into a certain question about religion. They had to delve into
a thesis.
They had to research it really deeply.
Mm.
So I think this concept of doing this thesis comes from the Muslim world.
Oh, wow.
We should talk about this in another program.
Yeah.
But what I want to say is that if you do research, you know that you cannot really understand something until you really have gone into it.
Yeah.
Mm.
So about how this came to be in the Muslim world, that now you have so much intolerance there, I wouldn't be able to give the answer really well.
Mm.
The least thing that we can say is that the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, prophesied that it would happen, that the Muslims would just forget about their values, and their religion would just become like old clothes that were worn, and that they would not understand their religion anymore at all. And this is definitely a sign of the fulfillment of that prophecy. But to take it apart and say that which factor led to which,
very difficult. Yeah,
I don't
unless
know.
you study in detail.
Maybe I can say one thing. We can answer from the Ahmadiyya point of view that Islam, and it also connects to our first part where we were saying that continuous revelation is actually what Islam is. And so the true Islam is actually a continuous line of people who are divinely inspired, like the saints and the mujaddids. So following them would always keep the Muslim values alive.
Oh, perfect answer.
And the greatest one of all these mujaddids and saints was the Messiah. So when the Muslim world,
who was Mirza Ghulam Ahmad,
peace be upon him,
founder of the Ahmadiyya community, who was born in 1835 and died in 1908.
Yeah, so he is the representative of this true Islam. The true is a revelation, and but most of the Muslim world rejected it.
Yeah.
So when they rejected the line of revelation, they also lost their values. And so I think this is probably what the answer will come to in the end.
Yes.
That the Muslims have not followed the Sirat al-Mustaqim and not followed the continuous line of revelation by accepting the promised Messiah.
This is a perfect verse which kind of, in a way represents what you just said very nicely. It's chapter 10, verse 40. It says, "Nay, but they have rejected that, the knowledge of which they did not encompass, nor has the true significance thereof yet come to them. In like manner did those before them reject the truth, but see what was the end of those who did wrong." So in other words, it's tying their rejection of something to the conclusion of their wrongful actions, because a prophet and a guide comes to correct people on their wrongful actions. But if they reject him, then those wrongful actions persist and get worse until those wrongful actions and wrongful ways actually consume the people who do them in this very life.
Yes. Yes, so I think it is a very religious answer to the question.
Yeah.
But probably it will be it will ultimately be the answer.
Yeah.
You might find, the sub themes in it. You can see what was the influence of colonialism, or what was the influence of modern philosophy, or whatever, nationalism. But probably in the end, this will probably be the answer.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Abdulhaq, for speaking to us. And we hope to see you again soon.
On your next visit to the UK.
It was a pleasure, and hope to be back.
Inshallah.